The galaxy had never been kind to newcomers, but humanity had never cared much about kindness. When the first human ships broke through the void and made contact with the galactic Concord 300 years ago, the response from the elder species was something between amusement and horror. They were small, fragile, laughably short-lived creatures who burned through their brief existences with a hunger that made the oldest civilizations deeply uncomfortable. They fought among themselves constantly. They competed over everything. They treated danger not as something to avoid, but as something to run toward with both hands open. And yet they survived. They did more than survive. They thrived in ways that should not have been possible. They colonized worlds that other species had written off as death traps. Worlds with crushing gravity, toxic atmospheres, extreme radiation. They looked at planets that the conquered had labeled uninhabitable and said, "We will make them ours." And somehow, impossibly, they reverse-engineered technologies in decades that had taken the Rithkai 1,000 years to develop. They adapted so fast that the conquered scientific councils had to invent new models just to explain how a species with such a short lifespan could innovate at such a terrifying pace. The answer, the scientists eventually concluded, was desperation. Humans were always dying. They knew it from the moment they were born. They carried that awareness like a fire in their chests, and it drove them to compress centuries of progress into single generations. They did not have the luxury of patience, so they replaced it with sheer, relentless will. The conquered tolerated them. They traded with them. They signed treaties and opened borders, and pretended that everything was fine. But behind closed doors, in the quiet chambers where the real decisions were made, the elder species whispered the same fear over and over. What happens when the humans stop fighting each other and start fighting us? Ambassador Vathari Sen of the Rithkai was one of the few who saw the humans differently. She had served alongside their diplomats for nearly 40 years, and she had come to understand something that most of her colleagues refused to accept. The humans were not simply aggressive, they were complicated. They could be brutal and tender in the same breath. They waged wars and wrote poetry about the horror of war. They built weapons of unimaginable destruction, and then created organizations dedicated to making sure those weapons were never used. They were a species at war with their own nature, and that internal conflict was what made them both dangerous and extraordinary. She respected them. She feared for them. She knew that the galaxy was not big enough to contain what humanity was becoming. And then one morning she woke to silence. Every human colony had gone dark. Every signal, every transmission, every beacon, gone. The comm channels that had once been filled with human chatter and music and arguments and laughter were empty. The trade routes that connected human space to the rest of the galaxy were abandoned. Ships floated in the void with no one aboard, as if the crews had simply stepped out and never returned. The conquered sent scouts. The scouts found nothing. They sent warships. The warships found even less. Earth's entire solar system had been wrapped in a barrier of energy that no scanner could read, and no weapon could scratch. It was a perfect sphere of absolute silence. Ships that flew too close were simply pushed away gently, but firmly, as if a giant invisible hand had decided that no one was allowed inside. Fleet Admiral Dorvan of the Kashiri Dominion was among the first military leaders to respond. He sent 3 of his finest cruisers to probe the barrier. All 3 were redirected without damage, but also without answers. He sent drones. The drones disintegrated on contact. He ordered a concentrated weapons barrage on a single point of the barrier. The energy simply vanished into the surface like water poured onto sand. Nothing worked. The barrier was absolute, and it was patient. It did not attack. It did not threaten. It simply existed. And in its existence, it said one thing very clearly: "You are not welcome here." The conquered held emergency sessions. For weeks the debates raged across every species, and every faction. Some demanded that the barrier be broken by force. Others argued that the humans had clearly destroyed themselves, and the barrier was nothing more than a tomb. Some whispered that it was a weapon, that the humans had finally built something terrible enough to end everything. and the barrier was all that stood between the galaxy and annihilation. Ambassador Sen stood before the council and said what no one else would say. She said that the silence did not feel like death. It felt like a door being closed deliberately and quietly by someone who intended to open it again someday. She said that in all her years working with humans, she had never known them to do anything without a reason, and she had never known them to give up on anything ever. The council listened politely and then ignored her. Within a decade, the panic faded. Within a generation, it was replaced by something far more dangerous. Relief. The humans were gone, the most unpredictable and unsettling species the galaxy had ever encountered had simply removed itself from the equation, and slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to celebrate. Monuments to human-conquered cooperation were taken down, trade agreements were voided, human cultural archives were moved to deep storage, where they gathered dust. Human languages were dropped from translation. Databases, their music stopped playing in public spaces. Their art was removed from galleries. Their history was reduced to a single chapter in conquered educational materials titled The Human Anomaly. And even that chapter was eventually made optional. Archivist Poland of the Conquered Remembrance Bureau was barely old enough to hold her position when she first stumbled upon the human records in deep storage. She was cataloging old diplomatic files when she found a box of human artifacts. A faded photograph of a family standing in front of a small blue house. A medal engraved with words in a language her translator could not parse. And a handwritten letter that someone had folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become soft as cloth. She did not know why these small things moved her so deeply, but they did. She began to dig further. She read everything she could find about the vanished species. She studied their wars and their art and their contradictions. She became the galaxy's foremost expert on a civilization that everyone else had decided to forget. Admiral Dorvan never forgot either. While the rest of the galaxy moved on, he kept a permanent watch on the barrier around Sol. He filed reports that no one read. He maintained sensor arrays that no one funded. He told anyone who would listen that the silence was not an ending. It was a pause. No one listened. 312 years passed. The galaxy changed. The humans became a myth, a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to frighten young cadets, the species that reached too far and paid the price. And then one night, across every border station and sensor array and deep space monitor in the galaxy, a single anomaly appeared on every screen at the same moment. The barrier around Sol had begun to pulse. It was slow and rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat, like something enormous drawing breath after a very long sleep. Admiral Dorvan was old now, older than he had any right to be. His hands trembled as he read the sensor data, but his voice was steady when he opened a channel to the Conquered and said 4 words that would change everything. They are waking up. The galaxy had always told itself that the humans were the problem. Every war that had ever broken out in their short presence on the galactic stage had been blamed on them. Their aggression, their unpredictability, their refusal to follow the careful unspoken rules that had kept the elder species in an uncomfortable but functional peace for millennia. The humans upset the balance that was the accepted truth, that was the story the Conquered told itself when the barrier went up and the silence began. But the truth was much uglier. The truth was that the balance had never been real. It had been a lie held together by mutual exhaustion and mutual fear. And one species that was too chaotic and too stubborn to let anyone else start a war without getting involved. The humans had not been the source of conflict in the galaxy. They had been the cork in the bottle. And when the cork was removed, everything that had been building pressure for 10,000 years came flooding out. It started small. The Kashiri Dominion had always resented the territorial concessions they had been forced to make during the Treaty of Veldon, a treaty brokered by human diplomats 60 years before the vanishing without humans to enforce the terms. The Kashiri quietly moved their border outposts 3 systems further into Rithkai space when the Rithkai protested. The Cachery responded that the treaty had been negotiated under human influence and was therefore invalid. Ambassador Vathari Sen watched this unfold with a cold knot forming in her chest. She had warned the council, she had told them that the humans had not merely been participants in galactic diplomacy. They had been the engine of it. They were the ones who could sit across the table from a species they had nothing in common with and find the one thread of shared interest that could hold a peace together. They did it not because they were wise, but because they were desperate. They needed peace to survive, and that need made them creative in ways that species who had never faced extinction could not understand. No one had listened to her, then no one listened to her now. The Cachery border expansion triggered the first real war in galactic history. Since the vanishing, it was called the Vorelian expansion, because the Vorelian Combine saw the chaos as an opportunity to seize resource-rich systems along the outer rim. They moved fast and they moved hard, and within 2 years they had conquered 14 inhabited worlds and displaced 6 billion beings of various species. The conquered responded the way it always responded, with debates and committees and strongly worded resolutions. The Vorelians ignored all of it. They had learned something that the humans had always known. Words without the willingness to back them up were just noise. The Second War came 5 years later. The Ashkara purges were not a war of conquest, but a war of hatred. The Ashkaran species had harbored a deep and ancient resentment toward the Delvani, a smaller and less powerful species that had once been their client race. The humans had brokered the Delvani Independence Agreement and had guaranteed its terms. With the humans gone, the guarantee was meaningless. The Ashkara moved in with surgical precision. They did not conquer the Delvani worlds, they cleansed them. The word that the galactic translators used was purification. But everyone knew what it meant. It meant cities burned to ash. It meant children taken from their families and re-educated in camps. It meant mass graves dug in the red soil of worlds that had been peaceful for generations. Ambassador Sen went before the council one final time. She was old now, her scales fading to gray, her voice thin but steady. She did not plead, she did not argue, she simply stated the facts. 3 major wars in less than a century, billions dead, entire civilizations displaced or destroyed, and the conquered doing nothing because the conquered had never actually been the thing keeping the peace. The humans kept the peace, she said, and the chamber was silent not because they agreed but because they did not want to admit that she was right. The Third War was the worst. The Pale Corridor conflict erupted along one of the galaxy's most critical trade routes, and it drew in 17 different species over the course of 3 decades. It was a war without clear sides or clear goals. Just a grinding, endless cycle of attack and retaliation, atrocity and revenge, until no one could remember what had started it, and no one could imagine how to end it. Refugee fleets drifted between systems. Stateless and starving entire generations were born on ships and died on ships without ever setting foot on solid ground. Piracy became more common than trade. Slavery returned to sectors where it had been abolished for thousands of years. The galaxy was not just at war, it was falling apart. Admiral Dorvan watched all of this from his post near the Sol barrier. He had been watching for over 300 years now, kept alive by Cachery longevity treatments and sheer stubborn refusal to die. His government had long since stopped funding his operation. He maintained the sensor arrays with a skeleton crew and his own personal resources. He filed reports that went into archives no one opened. But he saw things that no one else saw. Ships had been disappearing near the old human border zones, not destroyed. His sensors were clear on that point. They were being redirected. Something was pulling them in gently and sending them back days later with their crews unharmed, and confused. Their navigation logs showed gaps, hours or days of missing time, and every single ship that was returned had one thing in common. Their weapons systems had been permanently deactivated. Not damaged, not removed, deactivated at a level so fundamental that no engineer could figure out how to reverse it. The energy cores that powered their weapons were still intact, but they simply would not fire. It was as if someone had reached into the deepest architecture of the technology and flipped a switch that was not supposed to exist. Dorvan reported this to the Kashuri military command. They told him he was old and imagining things. He told them to send an investigation team. They told him the fleet was busy fighting 3 wars and did not have time for ghost stories. Archivist Poland was the only one who took him seriously. She had spent her entire career studying the vanished humans, and she had developed an instinct for their patterns. She traveled to Dorvan's station, and together they reviewed the data together. The redirected ships, the deactivated weapons, the missing time. And then Poland found something that changed everything. Buried in the old human diplomatic archives, in a file that had been encrypted with a system so advanced that it had taken Poland's computers 11 years to crack, was a final transmission. It had been sent from Earth exactly 6 hours before the barrier went up. The message itself was in a language that no translator in the galaxy could parse. Not any known human language, not any known alien language, something entirely new. But the metadata was readable, and in the metadata, repeated over and over in a pattern that could not be accidental, was a single word. Soon. Poland stared at the word on her screen and felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. She looked at Dorvan. The old admiral was smiling. Not a happy smile, but the grim, satisfied smile of a soldier who had been proven right after a very long wait. "I told them," he said quietly. "I told them it was not death, it was never death." That night the sensor arrays across the galaxy lit up with something that had not been seen in over 300 years. The barrier around Sol was not just pulsing anymore. It was contracting. Slowly, steadily, deliberately, the sphere of silence that had hidden humanity from the universe was pulling back like a curtain being drawn open, and behind it, where every species in the galaxy had expected to find ruins or graves or nothing at all, there was light. Not the cold light of dead technology or the harsh light of weapons fire. It was warm and immense and organized, structured in patterns that no known civilization had ever produced. It stretched across the entire solar system, from the orbit of Mercury to the edge of the outer planets, and it was so beautiful and so vast that the sensors could barely process what they were seeing. Poland's hands shook as she recorded the data beside her. Dorvan stood perfectly still, with his eyes fixed on the readings, and his old heart beating faster than it had in decades. "What is that?" Poland whispered. Dorvan did not answer right away. He watched the light grow brighter and brighter, until it filled every screen on the station, and he thought about the species he had spent his entire life watching for, the loud, messy, impossible species that had vanished into silence, and was now returning in a blaze of brilliance that the galaxy was not remotely prepared for. "That," he said finally, "is what humans look like when they have had 300 years to think." The barrier fell on a Tuesday. There was no explosion, no shockwave, no dramatic collapse. One moment the sphere of energy that had hidden humanity for over 3 centuries was there, immense and impenetrable and silent. And the next moment it was simply gone, dissolved like morning frost in sunlight, as if it had never existed at all. And behind it was something that made every sensor array in the galaxy stutter and recalibrate and stutter again, because what they were reading should not have been possible. Earth's solar system had been rebuilt. Not repaired, not restored, rebuilt from the ground up in ways that defied everything the conquered knew about physics and engineering, and the limits of what a single species could accomplish. Mars, which had been a frozen red desert when the humans vanished, was now green and blue with oceans and forests, and an atmosphere that read as perfectly breathable. Venus, which had been a hellscape of acid clouds and crushing pressure, was wrapped in a delicate shell of orbital platforms that had somehow transformed it into a garden world. Jupiter's moons were connected by shimmering bridges of light that appeared to be both physical structures and energy conduits at the same time. And around the sun itself hung the impossible, a partial Dyson swarm, thousands of platforms arranged in a pattern so precise and so elegant that the Concorde's best engineers would later say it looked less like technology and more like art. Admiral Dorvan stood at the observation window of his station and stared at the readings with tears running down his old weathered face. He had waited 312 years for this moment. He had been called a fool and a madman and a relic. He had watched the galaxy tear itself apart while he sat at his post and kept his sensors pointed at the silence. He had been right. The fleet emerged from the heart of the solar system like a river of silver and white, hundreds of ships, each one larger than anything the Concorde had ever built, moving in perfect formation with a grace that suggested they were not merely piloted, but were somehow alive. The designs were unlike anything in the galactic database. They were curved and flowing and organic, with surfaces that shifted and rippled like water. And they carried no weapons. Dorvan ran the scans 3 times because he was certain he was making an error. He was not. Every ship in the human fleet, every single one, was completely unarmed. No missile tubes, no energy arrays, no kinetic launchers, no point defense systems. Nothing. The largest fleet the galaxy had ever seen was as weaponless as a newborn child. The broadcast came on every frequency, in every known language simultaneously. Humanity returns. We come not to conquer, not to trade, not to negotiate. We come to end war. The response across the galaxy was immediate and chaotic. The Concorde Council erupted into emergency session, with representatives screaming over each other in a dozen languages. The Kashiri Dominion scrambled its war fleet. The Vorelian Combine pulled back to defensive positions. The species locked in the Pale Corridor conflict actually paused their fighting for the first time in 30 years, not out of peace, but out of shared bewilderment. Ambassador Vathari Sen heard the broadcast from her retirement quarters on Rithka Prime. She was ancient now, her body failing, her scales almost entirely gray. But when she heard that message, her eyes went sharp and clear, and she stood up from her chair with a strength she had not felt in decades. She requested immediate transport to the human fleet. It took the Concorde 6 hours of panicked debate to approve her request. She was the only being in the galaxy who had actually worked with humans, and the Council, despite having ignored her for 3 centuries, suddenly found her expertise very relevant. The human ship she boarded was called the Homecoming, and it was vast, a city in space, with corridors that stretched for kilometers and rooms that opened onto views of the stars that seemed too beautiful to be seen through mere windows. The air smelled like rain and growing things, and something else, something warm and indefinable that Sen could not name, but that made her feel calm in a way she had not felt in a very long time. The humans who greeted her were recognizably human. They still had those strange, soft faces, and those expressive eyes, and those restless hands that were always reaching for something. They still moved with that characteristic human energy, quick and purposeful, and a little bit impatient. But something had changed. It was not physical. They looked the same as they always had, perhaps a bit taller, a bit healthier, but fundamentally the same messy biological creatures. She remembered it was something in the way they carried themselves. There was a stillness at their center that had not been there before. The old humans she had known had always been vibrating with tension, a coiled readiness for fight or flight that never fully relaxed. These humans still had energy, still had passion, still had that burning drive that made them who they were, but the tension was gone, the fear was gone. They were calm in the way that deep water is calm, not empty but full, so full that nothing on the surface could disturb what lay beneath. A woman named Commander Aisha Okonkwo led Sen to a meeting chamber where a group of human leaders sat waiting. They were diverse in appearance, different skin tones, different features, different ages, but they all shared that same deep stillness, that same quiet certainty. "Ambassador Sen," Aisha said, and her voice was warm with genuine respect. "We remember you. We remember all of our friends among the stars. We have missed you." Sen sat down and looked at the faces around the table and felt something shift inside her chest. something that had been frozen for a very long time beginning to thaw. "Tell me," she said, "tell me everything, tell me what happened behind that barrier." And they told her. They told her about the first 50 years, the chaos, the collapse, the civil war that nearly ended everything. Humanity had withdrawn behind the barrier not out of strength, but out of desperation. They had been tearing themselves apart. Their technologies had advanced faster than their wisdom, and they had reached a point where the next war would be the last. They had sealed themselves away not to prepare for galactic conquest, but to survive long enough to solve the only problem that had ever truly mattered: how to stop fighting. They told her about the next century, the long, slow, painful work of understanding themselves at the deepest level. They had mapped the human brain with a precision that no species had ever achieved. They had identified every neurological pathway that led to aggression, to tribalism, to the dehumanization of others. They had studied every war in human history and cataloged every cause, every trigger, every pattern. They had built models of conflict so detailed that they could predict a war before the first shot was fired. And then they had begun to build the tools to prevent it. Not weapons, not control systems, not suppressors or inhibitors or anything that diminished what it meant to be human. They had built tools of understanding, technologies that could bridge the gap between minds, that could make one person truly feel what another person felt, that could dissolve the walls of ignorance and assumption and fear that made violence seem like the only option. They told her about the final century, the testing, the refinement, the slow and fragile process of building a society that had genuinely moved beyond war, not a society without disagreement or passion or conflict. They were very clear about this. They still argued fiercely. They still competed. They still got angry and frustrated and jealous and petty. But they had learned to do all of those things without reaching for a weapon. They had developed a culture where the impulse toward violence was not suppressed, but redirected, transformed into creativity, into innovation, into the kind of fierce, compassionate honesty that could solve problems that violence never could. "We did not become peaceful because we are better than we were," Aisha told Sen. "We became peaceful because we finally understood the full cost of what we were doing, and we decided the cost was too high." Sen listened to all of it, and when they finished, she sat in silence for a long time. The humans waited. They did not rush her. They did not push. They simply sat with her in the quiet and let her process what she had heard. Finally, she looked up and asked the question that she knew the entire galaxy would ask. "Your ships carry no weapons. How are you going to end war without the ability to enforce peace?" Aisha smiled, and it was a smile that Sen had never seen on a human face before: confident but not arrogant, certain but not rigid, powerful but not threatening. "Ambassador," she said, "weapons can only end a battle. They cannot end a war. Wars end when the people fighting them understand, truly understand, why they are fighting and what it is costing them. We do not carry weapons because we carry something far more powerful. We carry understanding, and we have had 300 years to perfect it." Sen looked at the commander, and for the first time in centuries, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The human fleet split into hundreds of smaller groups that day. Each group set a course for a different active war zone in the galaxy. They moved without urgency, but without hesitation, steady and sure and impossibly calm. Like surgeons walking into an operating room where the patient had been bleeding for 300 years. Admiral Dorvan watched them go from his station. He had waited his entire life for this moment. And now that it was here, he found that he was not afraid. He was not even surprised. He had always known the humans would come back. He had just never imagined they would come back like this. The first war zone the humans entered was the Pale Corridor. It was the longest and bloodiest of the galaxy's active conflicts, a grinding 30-year meat grinder that had consumed 17 species and turned one of the most prosperous trade routes in known space into a wasteland of shattered stations and drifting debris. The fighting had gone on so long that the original causes had been forgotten. buried under layers of atrocity and revenge, until the war had become self-sustaining. A machine that fed on hatred and produced nothing but corpses. 3 human ships entered the pale corridor without escort, and without announcement they flew directly into the space between the 2 largest opposing fleets. A Kashiri battle group, and a coalition of 5 smaller species that called themselves the Pale Alliance, and they stopped. Both fleets targeted them immediately. Thousands of weapons locked onto the unarmed human vessels. The commanders on both sides broadcast the same warning: leave now or be destroyed. The humans did not leave. They broadcast a single message in response. We are not here to fight. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to listen. If you destroy us, we will not resist, but before you fire, we ask one thing. Let us speak with your commanders face to face. No weapons, no guards, just conversation. The Kashiri admiral, a scarred veteran named Torvan, who had lost 2 of his 4 arms in the fighting, dismissed the request as absurd. The Pale Alliance commander, a Delvani named Resik, who had watched her homeworld burn during the Ashkara purges and had spent 20 years fighting to make sure it never happened again, dismissed it as a trap. But neither of them fired. Something about the human ships held them back. It was not fear. Both commanders had faced far more dangerous enemies. Something about the way the ships simply sat there, unarmed and unshielded, broadcasting their message on repeat with the calm patience of someone who had all the time in the universe. It made them hesitate. The humans waited for 6 hours, without moving, without threatening, without doing anything at all except existing in the space between 2 armies. Torvan broke first. He agreed to meet with the humans aboard his flagship. He told himself. It was curiosity, nothing more. He told himself. He wanted to understand what kind of species sent unarmed ships into a war zone. He told himself he was not afraid. The human mediator who came aboard was a small woman with dark skin and gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through everything. They rested on her name was Dr. Marin Cole, and she carried nothing. No datapad, no recording device, no weapon. She walked onto the bridge of the Kashiri flagship as if she were walking into her own home, and she looked at Admiral Torvan and she smiled. "Admiral," she said, "you have been fighting for 30 years. You have lost 11 ships and 42,000 soldiers. You have won 9 major engagements and lost 7. You are currently running low on fuel, and your crew has not had shore leave in 14 months. Your youngest officer is 19 years old and has never known a day of peace." Torvan stared at her. Every word she had spoken was classified information that no outsider could possibly have known. "How do you know these things?" he demanded. "Because we listened," Marin said. "We have been listening to your signals and your movements and your supply chains for months, but more importantly, we have been listening to your people. We have heard your soldiers talking to each other when they think no one else can hear. We have heard them say they are tired. We have heard them say they miss their families. We have heard them say they do not remember why this war started, and they do not understand why it continues." Torvan's jaw tightened. "My soldiers fight because they are ordered to fight. Your soldiers fight because they are afraid of what will happen if they stop," Marin said gently. "They believe the enemy will show no mercy because they have been told the enemy is a monster. They believe peace is impossible because they have never been shown what peace looks like." She paused. "Would you like to see what the enemy actually looks like?" She reached into her pocket and produced a small device. A flat crystal that fit in the palm of her hand. She placed it on the table between them and it activated, projecting a 3-dimensional image into the air. It was a Delvani child, a little girl, sitting in a refugee ship drawing pictures on a piece of scrap metal. With a piece of charcoal she was drawing her home. A house on a world she had never seen, because it had been destroyed before she was born. She was singing quietly to herself as she drew a song that her mother had taught her. A song about a garden that grew flowers the color of sunrise. Torvan watched the image and something in his face changed. It was a small change, a tightening around the eyes, a softening of the mouth. But Marin saw it and she knew that the first crack had appeared in the wall. She spent 3 hours with Torvald, not arguing, not negotiating, not trying to convince him of anything. She simply showed him the people on the other side. Not as enemies, not as abstractions, not as targets on a tactical display, but as living beings with families and fears and hopes and children who drew pictures of homes they had never seen. When she left, Torvald did not order his fleet to stand down, but he did not order them to fire either. On the other side of the corridor, Commander Resic received a visit from another human mediator, a tall man named Dr. James Ake, who carried the same quiet certainty and the same small crystal device he showed Resic the Cashieri soldiers. Young men and women who wrote letters home that they knew would never arrive, who held memorial services for fallen comrades in cramped ship corridors, who whispered to each other in the dark that they were scared. Resic wept. She had spent 20 years hatting the Cashieri, and in 3 hours a soft-spoken human had shown her that the people she hated were suffering just as much as the people she loved. Within a week, both fleets had agreed to a ceasefire. Within a month, formal peace talks had begun. Within 3 months, the Pale Corridor conflict, the war that everyone said would never end, was over. Across the galaxy, the same pattern repeated. On the Vorelian frontier, the humans deployed a technology that the conquered scientists could not explain. A field emitted by their ships that altered the neurological processing of every sentient being within its radius. It did not suppress aggression. It did not chemically alter anyone's brain. It did something far more subtle and far more powerful. It made it impossible to dehumanize the enemy. Within the field, soldiers looked across the battlefield and saw not targets, but people. They saw faces, they saw fear, they saw themselves reflected in the eyes of the beings they had been told to kill. The effect was not permanent. It wore off after a few hours. But by then it was too late. The soldiers had seen the truth, and the truth could not be unseen. Weapons dropped, soldiers sat down. Some began to talk, some began to cry, some walked across the line that separated friend from enemy, and simply sat down next to the people they had been trying to kill and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. On the Ashkara worlds, where genocide had left scars so deep that they had become part of the cultural identity of both perpetrator and survivor, the humans did something even more profound. They brought memory integration technology. Devices that could link two minds and allow one person to experience the complete unfiltered memories of another. The Ashkara were shown what their victims had felt, not described to them, not explained to them, but felt directly and completely with no distance and no defense. Survivors were shown what the perpetrators had experienced: the propaganda, the fear, the slow erosion of empathy that had made ordinary people capable of extraordinary evil. It was the most painful process anyone had ever endured. Beings collapsed under the weight of what they felt. Some could not speak for days afterward, some never fully recovered. But it worked, because once you have truly felt what another person has suffered, once you have carried their pain inside your own mind and felt it as if it were your own, you cannot go back to pretending they are less than you. You cannot reduce them to a number or a category or a slur. You have lived their life for a few terrible minutes, and it has changed you forever. Not every species welcomed the humans. There were those who saw them as the ultimate threat. A species that could end war could also control peace. A coalition of military commanders from 12 different species formed a resistance. They called themselves the Sovereign Guard, and they declared that humanity's interference in galactic affairs was an act of aggression that demanded a military response. The Sovereign Guard assembled the largest fleet that had been gathered since the beginning of the Pale Corridor conflict. Over 4,000 warships from a dozen species, all pointed at a single human flagship. They fired everything: missiles, energy beams, kinetic rounds, weapons that bent space itself, all of it concentrated on a single unarmed ship. The volley was so massive that it briefly created a small artificial star at the point of impact. When the light faded, the human ship was untouched. Every warhead, every beam, Every projectile had been deconstructed at the atomic level in the instant before impact. The energy had not been destroyed. It had been redirected, converted, transformed into a pulse that radiated outward and washed over a nearby planet that had been scarred by radiation from a decades-old bombing campaign. Where the pulse touched the soil healed, where it touched the water cleared, where it touched the sky the clouds that had been thick with toxic fallout for 20 years parted. And for the first time in a generation sunlight fell on the surface. The Sovereign Guard's admiral received a private transmission. "We understand your fear. You believe that if we can end war, we can impose tyranny. You are right. We could. That is why we have built every safeguard imaginable to ensure we never do come aboard. See for yourself. Verify everything. Trust nothing we say. Only what you witness." The admiral went aboard. He spent 3 days on the human ship. He was shown everything. The technology, the philosophy, the history, the failures, the safeguards. He tested everything. He questioned everything. He tried to find the lie, the hidden agenda, the secret weapon. He found nothing but honesty. Archivist Poland arrived at the human fleet 6 months after the return. She had spent her entire life studying humanity from records and artifacts. And now, she was finally standing among the living, breathing reality of the species. She had devoted herself to understanding. She walked through the corridors of the homecoming, and she watched the humans live, watched them argue and laugh and work and play and disagree passionately, and resolve their disagreements without a single raised fist. She watched them create art that made her weep and build technologies that made her mind spin and love each other with a fierce tenderness that seemed impossible from a species that had once been the galaxy's most prolific warriors. On her last evening aboard, she sat with Commander Okonkwo and asked the question that the entire galaxy was thinking. Why? You could have ruled everything. You had the power to conquer every species in the conquered, and none of them could have stopped you. Why come back just to bring peace? Okonkwo looked at her for a long time, and then a human historian named Dr. Elias Vance leaned forward and answered in a voice that was quiet and heavy with the weight of 300 years of memory. Because we nearly did not survive learning this lesson. We lost millions of our own people behind that barrier. We fought ourselves to the edge of extinction before we understood what we were doing. We learned the cost of war not from a textbook, but from the ashes of our own cities and the graves of our own children. He paused, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been fire. We will not let the galaxy make the same mistake. 50 years after the return, the galaxy was so quiet that the silence itself had become unremarkable. The last organized act of interspecies violence had occurred 17 years ago, a border dispute between 2 minor species in the Outer Rim that had flared into a brief, ugly skirmish before human mediators arrived and spent 3 days sitting with the leaders of both sides. The fighting stopped on the morning of the 4th day, not because anyone was forced to stop, but because the leaders walked out of that room and told their soldiers to go home, and their soldiers, who had been sitting together sharing rations with the enemy for 3 days because the humans had gently suggested it, were already halfway there. That was the last war. Not the last disagreement. The conquered chambers were still loud and contentious, and sometimes outright hostile species still competed for resources and territory and influence. Individuals still committed crimes of passion and greed and anger. The galaxy was not a paradise, and the humans had never promised it would be. But war, the organized, systematic, industrial-scale application of violence by one group against another, had become something that the galaxy could no longer quite imagine. It was not forbidden, it was not suppressed, it was simply unnecessary. Like building a fire by rubbing sticks together, when every home had heat. It still existed as a concept in history books, but the idea of actually doing it felt as distant and strange as the idea of eating raw meat in the dark. The tools that made this possible had been given freely to every species in the galaxy. The humans had insisted on this from the very beginning. No patents, no licenses, no conditions, no control. The conflict dissolution techniques the empathy technologies, the memory integration systems, the neurological bridging devices. All of it was open-sourced and distributed to every civilization that wanted it, along with complete documentation and training programs, and the humans' own unsparing history of how they developed these tools and what it cost them. Some species had initially refused to accept the technology. They saw it as a trap, a way for humanity to make the galaxy dependent on human systems, and then pull the rug out when the time was right. The humans responded to this suspicion with something that baffled and infuriated the skeptics. Complete transparency. They opened every database, they revealed every line of code. They invited engineers from every species to disassemble their technology down to the atomic level and verify that there were no hidden controls, no kill switches, no backdoors. There were none. The technology was exactly what the humans said it was, a set of tools for understanding, and nothing more. What species did with those tools was entirely up to them. The humans would help if asked, but they would not impose. They would teach if invited, but they would not preach. They had learned the hard way that peace could not be forced on anyone. It had to be chosen freely and completely, or it was not peace at all, but just another form of control. Ambassador Vathari Sen gave the speech that defined a generation on the floor of the reformed Galactic Concord in the 367th year. After the vanishing, she was impossibly old by then. The oldest living Rithkai, kept alive by medical technologies that the humans had shared without being asked. Her body was frail, and her voice was thin, but every being in the chamber leaned forward to hear her, because she was the last living person who remembered both the old galaxy and the new. She spoke slowly and carefully, and every word carried the weight of centuries. "I remember the humans," she said. "I remember them when they were young and loud and dangerous. I remember the fear they caused, and the resentment they inspired. I remember the day they vanished, and I remember the relief that swept through this chamber when the silence fell. We told ourselves that the galaxy was better without them. We told ourselves that they had been the source of our problems, and that their absence was our salvation." She paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of 100 different species. Species that 50 years ago had been killing each other, and were now sitting side by side and arguing about trade policy, as if that were the most natural thing in the universe. "We spent 300 years grateful for their absence," she said. "We should have spent those years terrified of what we would become without them." The chamber was silent, not the uncomfortable silence of disagreement, but the heavy, respectful silence of a truth that everyone recognized. "The humans did not return to save us," Sen continued. "They returned because they understood something that we did not, that the galaxy is a family, and that families do not abandon each other even when they are angry, even when they are hurt, even when they need to go away for a while to heal. They always come back. They always come back." She sat down, and the chamber remained silent for a long time, and when the applause finally came, it was not the polite, formal applause of diplomatic courtesy, but something deeper and rawer. The sound of 4,000 representatives from 100 species expressing a gratitude that none of them had the words to fully articulate. Admiral Dorvan visited Earth for the first time that same year. He had spent his entire career watching the planet from a distance, first through the barrier, then through sensor readings, always from the outside looking in. Now, he walked its surface and breathed its air, and felt its gravity pull at his old bones. Earth had been transformed, but it had also been preserved. The cities were new, clean, and beautiful, and filled with green spaces that grew wild and untamed, because the humans had decided that nature should be allowed to be messy. But scattered among the new buildings were older structures that had been carefully maintained. Monuments and museums and memorials that told the story of what humanity had been before they changed. Dorvan walked through a garden that had once been a weapons testing ground. The soil had been cleaned, and the craters had been filled, and now it bloomed with flowers from 100 different worlds, species that had been brought to Earth by alien visitors. and planted alongside native roses and sunflowers and wild grasses. The air smelled like honey and rain and growing things. A human child found him there, a girl of perhaps 7 years old with dark curly hair and bright curious eyes. She was collecting insects in a jar and studying them with the focused intensity that Dorvan had come to recognize as a uniquely human trait. "What are you?" she asked, looking up at him without any fear at all. "I am Admiral Dorvan of the Kashiri Dominion," he said. "What is an admiral?" she asked. He opened his mouth to answer, and then stopped. He looked at the child, this small, fearless creature who had never known war, who lived on a world where the very concept of organized violence was a historical curiosity. And he realized that he could not explain what an admiral was without explaining what a navy was, and he could not explain what a navy was without explaining what a war was, and he could not explain what a war was in any way that would make sense to a child who had never seen one. "I am a very old person who watches the stars," he said finally. The child considered this and apparently found it satisfactory. "I watch bugs," she said, and held up her jar for his inspection. Dorvan looked at the insects crawling over each other inside the glass, and he laughed. A real laugh, deep and unexpected. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere very old and very tired that has finally been allowed to rest. Archivist Poland completed her life's work that year. A comprehensive history of the species that had vanished from the galaxy and returned to save it. The book was enormous. 12 volumes covering everything from humanity's first stumbling steps on the African savanna to their return from behind the barrier. It drew on human archives and alien records in Poland's own decades of personal observation and interviews, and it was hailed as the definitive account of the most extraordinary species the galaxy had ever produced. The final chapter was titled "The Species That Fought Itself Until It Learned, Then Taught the Stars." In it, Poland wrote about the paradox at the heart of the human story, that the species which had been most prone to violence was also the species that ultimately solved it. She wrote that this was not a contradiction, but a necessity, that only a species that had experienced the full horror of war could develop the tools to end it, that only a species that had stood at the edge of self-destruction and looked into the abyss and chosen to step back could teach others how to do the same. She wrote that the humans were not saints and had never claimed to be. They were flawed and stubborn, and sometimes infuriating. They argued too much, and they felt too deeply, and they had a maddening tendency to believe that every problem could be solved if you just worked at it long enough. But it was precisely those qualities, the stubbornness, the passion, the refusal to accept that anything was impossible, that had allowed them to do what no other species had ever done. They had waged war against their own nature, and they had won. The galaxy was quiet now, not the old silence, the empty, frightened silence of a species that had vanished and left a hole in the universe. That silence had been the absence of something vital, a wound that the galaxy had pretended not to feel even as it bled. This was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of a garden in the early morning, full of life and growing things, so rich and so complete that it needed no sound to prove it was there. This was the silence of a child drawing pictures of flowers on a world that had once built bombs. This was the silence of an old soldier sitting in the sun with his eyes closed, and his shoulders finally relaxed after a lifetime of watching for a war that would never come. This was the silence of peace. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a vault carved into living rock and sealed with the most advanced security the humans had ever devised, there was a record, a complete unedited record of those 300 years behind the barrier. Every war they fought against themselves, every city they burned, every life they lost, every moment of despair and rage and grief that they endured before they finally found the path to something better. The vault was sealed not out of shame, but as a warning, a reminder to every future generation of humans, and to every species that might someday face the same choice, that the road to peace was not paved with good intentions, it was paved with graves. The inscription on the vault door was written in every human language, and every alien language that the translators could accommodate. Thousands of scripts and symbols all saying the same thing. We did not become peaceful because we were good, we became peaceful because we understood at last the full cost of what we were. Let no species pay this price again. Above the vault the garden grew. And in the garden, a child with dark curly hair released her insects from their jar and watched them fly away into the warm, sweet air of a world that had finally learned what it was for. And the galaxy, vast and ancient and scarred and healing, turned slowly in the light of 1 billion stars and was quiet and was full and was at peace. And it was enough.